All right. So to start off, we like to play a little game called This or That. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and you have to pick this or that. Makes sense. So Android or iPhone?
That.
Like Android or iPhone? Like which one would you like? Which one would you pick? No, you got to pick one of the options.
I'm keeping all of this in.
Seriously?
Your scale is all wrong, Steiner. This or that, so iPhone.
Science or history?
Science.
Spring or autumn?
Spring.
A startup or an established business?
Startup.
Bachelor's or master's?
Bachelor's.
Babies dressed as animals or animals dressed as humans?
Babies dressed as animals.
Passion or stability?
Ooh, passion.
Money or love?
Love.
City or countryside?
City.
Animals or people?
Animals.
All of those answers made a lot of sense.
Yeah. All the dots are connecting.
Yep.
Welcome to the 4th episode of Marketing by the Minute, Season 2. This season's called On the Scene because we're an alumni's place of business. Today we're shaking it up a little bit as we're in Dan Purdy's office, technically at his place of business. This podcast is being created, run, and edited by a team of students in the Integrated Marketing Communications class here at Western. And we're your hosts, Steiner Michelson.
And Talia Ackerman-Gray.
And with us today, we have Dan Purdy.
After enrolling at the MBA program at Western, Dan Purdy accidentally became a professor while still in school. His career at the university took some turns. He's been the associate director of the MBA program, director of the Western Front Door to Discovery program, to a senior instructor of marketing. He now has his own business, Real Simple Solutions, alongside his teaching career. Tune into the rest of the episode to hear how it all happened.
Thank you for being on the podcast today, Dan. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So just to start off, can you elaborate on your personal background a little bit, like where you're from?
Well, I kind of grew up on the east side and then in Tacoma. Moved around a lot when I was a kid for various reasons, but that's kind of like the epicenter. And then graduated from high school in Tacoma and went to college and then ended up dropping out of college. I think I counted 4 times somewhere along the line. Joined the Navy, as many of us are wont to do when we're in search of something else, and then eventually ended up in Bellingham many years later.
How did you end up in Bellingham?
So the story actually begins when my brother Dave graduated from high school and came to Western. And I had never heard of Western before, and he was my older brother, so I'm 16, a sophomore in high school, and I visit Western with my older brother, who then came here as a freshman. And so I visited several times. Back then, the Greyhound bus station was on Garden Street, and so I would take the bus from Tacoma to Bellingham, get off at Garden Street, and then walk up the hill with my bag to Nash, where he had his dorm room.
Huh.
Yeah.
So you visited your brother. That's kind of how you discovered Bellingham. Was it ever in your mind thought of leaving Tacoma and then either moving up to Bellingham, or was there a step in between that?
Yeah, there was several steps in between actually, because when I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Puget Sound on a football scholarship and played football. Wasn't a very good student. Joined a fraternity, spent way more time at the fraternity playing pool than actually in class learning. And so that was my first failed attempt at college. I joke that I left as a 3rd semester sophomore because I had enough credits to be a sophomore, but I'd been there much longer than a sophomore should be there. So I actually dropped out in my junior year, but I didn't have enough credits to be a junior. And so I didn't originally think about Bellingham or Western, but after joining the Navy and then getting out, I wanted to finish my degree. And I thought of Bellingham, and I thought of Western because my brother had a great experience here. And so, I visited and explored and then applied, and they said, sure, come on up. And little did they know that was going to be a trend, as I dropped out twice more, I think, before I actually finished.
So, I guess further down the road, after you graduated, what sort of realities hit you, and then what did you do after you got your master's?
Oh boy. Well, I think the first thing was that I finished my undergrad here and then immediately went into the MBA program. But part of that was because of the realities. That was 2004, 2005 era, and I was, thinking about going into the tech world. Microsoft was booming at that time. Google was nascent. It was there, but it was small. Facebook had just barely begun. MySpace was king of the social media space at that time. So I was thinking about going into the tech world and moving down to Seattle and doing all that sort of thing. I'm doing lots of looking around and that sort of thing. But I, as a non-traditional student who was a little bit older, didn't really want to be perceived as a 22-year-old recent grad. And I had some management experience from the Navy and from being in the industrial world. I was in the civilian electrical power field. And so I had some experience, and I wanted to be perceived differently. This goes back to branding, right? Like I'd taken those classes, and I'm like, all right, how do I position myself and all that sort of thing? So the MBA seemed like a good way to continue my education and to reposition myself more to a managerial or an executive level, and a little bit further away from sort of a new grad like many of the colleagues that I had gone through school with.
I really like how you said that you kind of went into the MBA program to position yourself. I like how you frame that as kind of a perception thing. And it's been a while since you graduated. Now you're running your own business. So tell us a little bit about what inspired the creation of Real Simple Solutions.
Oh boy. Yeah, well, it's kind of, as many things in my journey, it was serendipitous. So it's around 2011, maybe 2010, 2011, and I'd been teaching for several years. I was managing the MBA program at the time here at Western. And one of the things that I was doing was working on an entrepreneurship aspect to Western. And at that time, we didn't have an entrepreneurship program. We didn't really have anything like that. And so did several startup weekends and things like that. And I was working with the director of our local technology alliance. And he brought a speaker to town who introduced a concept that I had never really heard of before, which was called Agile. And y'all will know it very well because I teach it in class now. And I always joke in class, like, a lot of what I teach you guys I didn't learn in school because things have changed.
Right.
And so we have to learn, we have to become lifelong learners and be curious and develop things. So long story short, I experienced this in a very small, there was 8 people there. And it was sort of it was down at the old Woods Coffee downtown, which is not there anymore, kind of in the Flatiron building. And it was an hour-long practical exposure to Agile philosophy and the process of what is called a lean coffee. And it was really wonderful to learn that from the guy who had developed the lean coffee. And it was a pretty... I don't know, I was one of those moments where your brain just sort of opens up. You're like, whoa. Because a lot of things that I have been trying to do working in sort of marketing and the creativity field and these sort of things were, I found that it was easy to comprehend, but it was super hard to do. It was hard to execute. And here I see a tool that would help me do that. And so I come back to work after this event, and I start immediately practicing it. And I start to use this technique called a lean coffee, which then I innovated into what I call a lean meeting. And I teach this to product managers, and y'all have probably experienced it in your work with your product manager, Jace. But the idea simply is that we can get people thinking about what we want them to answer for questions or what we want them to do for tasks, whatever it is, without talking. So when we have talking meetings, all of our brains work in series. One person goes, then another person that goes, then another person goes, right? But when we work together, we work in parallel. This is how supercomputers work, right? Is that all this processing happens in parallel, not one by one, but at the same time. And the other thing we do is we eliminate bias. Right? The minute I open my mouth, I bias everybody else's thoughts. And of course, that's not very useful for creativity. We want to know what everybody thinks, just not what the person who talks the most is. So I bring this back to campus, and I start doing it in meetings. And I start showing people how to do it, and I start doing it with them, actually running meetings this way and everything, and people love it. They're just like, wow. And I have this one particular colleague who I worked with who helped us promote our weekend MBA program in Everett. And she coined the phrase, I love this, Dan. It's just really simple. And I one of the things I'm always thinking about is how do we bring more authenticity into our marketing? And that was the most authentic name that I could come up with. It's just what I try to do is help people realize that at a basic level, it's real simple.
Yeah.
The executing it is awfully difficult. But if we can develop methods to take the cognitive overload and bring it down in the planning stages, in the development stages, and this sort of thing, then it's easier to execute, and we have fewer barriers. We spend so much time planning, and then we never execute. And this is the story of academia, right? Where students will write a marketing plan for an entire quarter,
Right.
and then they don't execute the plan. Well, at least half, if not more, of the learning is based on the execution. How does it go, right? And so you can see how now that evolved into the experience that you have, creating media and getting feedback from the market and making mistakes along the way, and that all of that has to then be okay, versus this idea that we have to get it right the first time,
Right.
or else we'll never get another chance, which is not really an effective way to learn. But unfortunately, it's a lot of our academic world is structured that way.
Yeah. So it seems like this kind of idea of marketing being real simple has informed your business, but also clearly your teaching philosophy as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The agile philosophy, in my mind, is essentially a philosophy for the scientific method. And that, when we develop a hypothesis, then we have to test it, right?
Yeah.
So that we have to develop a plan to test it. We have to develop an experiment. We have to do it. Well, then we have to think about, well, what are the results from the test? So we got to check the actual feedback from the test. And then, of course, we have to think about, what does that all mean, right? This is the analysis, and then we revise our hypothesis. That's all we're doing in Agile. What we have done is put some guardrails on it. Let's do this in 2 weeks.
Right.
And I literally will have people say to me, college students can't do that in 2 weeks. And I'm like, really? Because I'm watching them do it. And they're like, yeah, but they can't do it. I'm like, all right, that's cool, like whatever, but I'm watching them do it. And now, is it always perfect? No. I think the key thing that we always have to remind ourselves in this process is it's about learning. It's not about being perfect. And this will continue for the rest of your career because, as I said, when I came on the scene in the early 2000s, Facebook really hadn't even started yet. I developed my first website essentially using a website builder through Yahoo. This is like 2001. MySpace was king of the social media networks, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, the world has changed so much. And you have to continue learning. You have to continue developing because none of this stuff is going to stay static.
Right. I have just a funny question. What is the why in simple for?
Well, the first thing is practical. So there's actually a company out there called Real Simple that has a magazine. And so they have a brand. And I needed to practically differentiate from that so that, A, I don't think I'm a big enough thing that they're going to sue me or cease and desist or anything else like that. But one of the things I'm always trying to do is practice what I preach.
Right.
And so, in teaching my students and helping my clients, I oftentimes get this question, and the idea is like you've got to be able to trademark and protect your brand. And if you have the identical name as somebody else, that becomes difficult. Not impossible, but it becomes difficult. So, if you think about Apple Computer versus Apple the music company, which Apple the music company is who manages the Beatles titles, right? So when the Beatles formed their publishing company, they called it Apple. So you can have organizations that have the same name, but it's very, very difficult and it's expensive to maintain that. So I simply differentiated. That's the practical reason. The other is more symbolic, which is I'm pretty famous for asking why. And
That's true.
I make students a little crazy in classes by just simply, I always refer to it as, it's the toddler method. I just say, but why? And that forces them then to dig deeper into their box of explanations, which is where you really, I think, have to learn, when you have to find a second and a third and a fourth way to think about it versus the one way that makes sense to you, but maybe not everybody else in the room. And you'll learn as you become managers that how you think about it and your perspective, that's relevant, but that may not land the same way for somebody else.
Right.
In which case, then you have to try a second version. And if you don't have that second version, you just keep repeating yourself. And repeating yourself is not a good way to communicate. If you have to repeat yourself more than maybe the first time they didn't hear you, but if you have to say it 3 or 4 times, chances are it's not that they didn't hear you, they don't understand, or they're tuning you out, which means you have to figure out a different way to say it. Right?
Yep.
So anyway, that's the story of the why in real simple. So SYMPLE. Yes.
I love that explanation, actually. I think the why definitely rings true. You have asked me why many, many times.
Yes, and that will continue.
I do have a quick question. So when you said lean coffee earlier, what is that referring to?
So a lean coffee is a method that was developed by a couple of entrepreneurs in Seattle, and perhaps we'll be able to find their names and float them underneath this because I can't remember them off the top of my head. But the lean coffee was developed in order to quickly be able to develop a work plan and then start executing and using simple sticky notes. So the basic idea is you should sit down with a pile of sticky notes, one person or 2 or 3 or however many, and everybody just empties their head of all the things we need to do.
Right.
And then you organize it in some order, right? The order that we need to do it, what we think are most important. Then you can have conversations about it. That's the simple idea. And they called it a lean coffee because they did it over coffee.
Oh, there you go.
Right? That was the origin of it. I learned that at this event that I talked about earlier in 2011. And that's what then I started actually teaching to people and using in my consulting, so that we get away from this idea of I ask a question and then one person talks and another person talks and an hour goes by. We have nothing done. We have no work plan. It's just lots and lots of talking. We have captured nothing. We have no work artifact, right? But if you actually sit down and ask 5 people to all write for 10 minutes and then put it all up on a whiteboard and get them standing up, and now let's organize it, let's prioritize it, let's talk about what's interesting or what's missing, right? All of a sudden, they become engaged in a way they don't do when they're all just sitting around talking. And at the end, we actually have a working plan. Now, as we talk a lot about in class, it's not always a good draft, right? But it's a draft. We can work with a draft. If you got nothing, you got nowhere to go.
Absolutely. So, I think I may know your answer to this. Would you do anything differently if you could do it all over again?
Oh, wow. Would I do anything differently? Boy, I really struggle with that. I mean, yeah, I think there's some classic things like, maybe I should have finished college the first, second, third time, something like that. But if I'd finished college the first time, I wouldn't have met my wife.
Right.
Maybe I should have gone and worked for Google in 2006 or 5 or 6. One of my first students went to Facebook in 2008.
Oh, wow.
It's still there, right? And I think, gosh, what would it, what would that have been like? But if I had done that, then I wouldn't have discovered teaching. So I think that, there are certainly things in everybody's life that maybe they think they would have done differently. but I'm not so sure that is better. I think one of the things that is important to remind yourself of is that it's great to have a plan. It absolutely is great. Planning is absolutely wonderful. However, we can't stay wedded to the plan, because I can tell you that in the last 15 years, very little has gone according to plan. I had a plan, and yet very little went according to plan. And yet what's worked out has been wonderful. And I couldn't have imagined it. In fact, a professor that was one of my mentors, when I suggested that maybe someday I could teach, laughed at me. And I distinctly remember that, standing in the hall, upstairs here in Parks Hall, and they laughed at me. And it turns out later they became one of my greatest mentors. But at the time, they didn't know, and it didn't resonate for them, right? So I think that's an important concept that we have to remind ourselves. Life is what's happening when we're making other plans. And so plans are great, but many of the things in my life happened through being in the right place, saying yes, luck, right? A good deal of luck, right? Be in the right place at the right time. Just, I'd love to say that everything that I accomplished was due to my own whatever, hard work or merit or whatever, but a lot of it is being in the right place at the right time. I have people who come to me and say, Dan, I'd like to teach at the university. How did you do it? And I'm like, well, I don't know if you can recreate spending years earning sort of credibility with people in a department, and then be in the right place at the right time when one of them gets sick and you need to cover for them in a week's notice, and you say yes, and then you can do what I did. But it's really hard. It's just not that easy to replicate. And I think this is a concept that we call causal ambiguity in management, which is, even if you could exactly copy those things, because you don't have exactly the same makeup, you might not be successful, right? I don't believe that I can do what other people do and be successful. I've tried it. I've watched what they do, and I'm like, that is awesome. Let me try that. I try it. It doesn't work at all. And I think that's because it's not authentic. I think you have to figure out authentically what works for you, which is why I think it's so important in college. You guys are getting exposed to all these different styles and all these different beautiful brains that work in different ways. And we don't vibe with everybody, and that's okay, right? That's fair. Everybody's different. Diversity is an important element, that it's good that we have lots of different things. But I think that's the thing, is you can pick up a thing here, you can pick up a thing there, you can mash it up, and you can develop something that's authentically you, versus trying to copy what somebody else does. Because I don't think copying what they do is the secret. In marketing, we talk about differentiation. And if you copy what they do, why would they choose you over them?
Right.
Better be price. That's the only thing left, right? Well, I don't know anybody who says, I'd like to be the cheapest one in the room. If I could just be the lowest priced option that you want to hire, that would be fantastic. Nobody ever says that, right? So if we don't want that, well, then let's not produce a world in which we're just copycatting what everybody else does. That doesn't mean that we can't take something that they do and go, ooh, now that I really like.
Right.
I think of it like trying on shirts. You're going to see lots of things. Try them on. Maybe they fit, maybe they don't. If they fit, how do you make it yours? If it doesn't fit, take it off and put it back on the rack. Nothing wrong with that. I've tried lots of things that didn't work, which is how I got to kind of what works for me. But I don't think somebody else could just immediately copy what I do and be successful.
Right.
Because it's not the same thing, right? And I think that's the important part about authenticity and differentiation that doesn't always come through, I think, in the textbooks. We talk about differentiation and positioning and perception and all these different things, and yet, how do you do it?
Right.
And I think that's a continual idea of sort of, taking a step and then looking at what happens and then modifying it a little bit. And really, this is just hypothesis testing. And then, of course, what do? We put that into a container we call Agile. We put some structure to it, hey, every 2 weeks we're going to do this and we're going to do that, right? And you get a toolbox full of stuff. Now you can systematize the idea of the scientific method and learning. And the idea of systematizing, what's so important about that is that it's really hard to do. Some people are intuitively good at it. Other people don't get it at all. A system allows people who don't intuitively get it to practice it with coaching and mentorship. Now, maybe eventually they'll be independent and they'll be able to do it without it. Maybe they'll always need the system. That's okay. The idea, though, is they'll be able to do it, and a system is something we can teach. So you can walk into a company that doesn't have a track record of executing, and you
Right.
can help teach them how.
Right. And that's the idea behind Real Simple.
Absolutely.
And the idea behind a lot of your teaching. I think absolutely one of your biggest lessons, at least for me as a student, has been to be okay when the plan doesn't work.
Yeah.
To adjust and to constantly learn and to not freak out when what you plan doesn't go completely right.
Yeah, it was a year or so ago. I can't remember the exact date, but we're sitting at a faculty meeting. It was a meeting where a bunch of people who had won teaching awards are meeting with the sponsor of the teaching award. And Kat and I were lucky enough to win a teaching award, and so we're in this room and we're talking to all these other professors who'd won teaching awards. And Tom Rail, who's taught international business here for a long time at Western and is a fabulous professor, he's talking about his experience leading students doing real live projects for companies. And he said a phrase that I absolutely love, that is, we have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that is such an advanced idea that, quite frankly, in academia, we write the tests, we know the answers, we've taught the case study for 5 years. We're comfortable because we're comfortable. We know the answers. Like this, Well, when we run live projects like what we do in Marketing 381 and 382, when we run live projects like we do in Applied IMC and IMC, there's no answer key. So I don't know what's going to happen. Some teams are going to do wonderful, and other teams are going to go a whole different. That's very difficult to be comfortable with, and that's one of the things that we learn, I think, and one of the things I want you guys to learn much earlier in your career than I ever did, which is it's okay to be uncomfortable, right? If we're comfortable, we're probably not really pushing the boundaries of what we can do. In the career world, you should always be nervous to take that next job. If you're not, that job is probably not a big enough step for you, right? If it's like easy, you like no big deal, and so that's how you get stuck, is you don't challenge yourself. And I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with finding a place where you're comfortable and staying there for 25 years. That's a way, but I think that's more the norm because of inertia. You don't need to learn that. You're going to do that anyway. My job is to help you learn how not to do that, which is, how do you be a lifelong learner? How you say, I need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable, which means I got to be able to say to my boss, I don't know how it's going to work out. Just do it anyway. I got a system. And even though it may not work out the way we think, it's going to work out better in the long run than we ever could have imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this all the time in class. I could not come up with better assignments and challenges than the market gives you guys.
Right. Right.
And then we learn, how do we learn from that feedback from the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if I tried to just figure everything out in a simulation and figure out every possible, I would never be able to think of all the things, and therefore you wouldn't learn as much, right? So we got to become comfortable with being uncomfortable.
And
Oh, so when you were kind of thrust into the role, as you like to call it, the accidental professor, was being uncomfortable kind of a part of that? Like, did you find yourself being like excessively uncomfortable, and how did you adapt?
Yeah. So how that happened is I'm sitting in my office. I'm a graduate assistant, about to graduate from the MBA program in a couple months. It's right before spring quarter, and the department chair walks down the hall and says, "Hey Dan, how are you?" And I said, "I'm fine." And he said, "Well, Professor so-and-so is got to go on emergency leave, and we need somebody to teach Marketing 381. Would you be interested in that?" And I didn't really know what to say. I had never taught in the university before, and nothing like that. And I just said, "Oh, I guess I'm not. How would I do that?" He said, "Well, the professor's left all the materials for you in the office here. You just come down and get them and start working on it. And you can use the previous syllabi as sort of a guideline, and there you go." So I had a week to prepare, and I got an email from the professor who gave me some very sage guidance, because she literally was on emergency leave, and I think she sent the email from a plane somewhere, and she said, "Look, you just have to stay 1 week ahead of the students. You don't have to have it all figured out. It's okay. Because I had taken the class, I had done well in the class, I had taken other research classes, like I had done more advanced work than I was teaching, but I had never really taught this material before. And boy, was it unnerving, right? To stand in front of a group of 35 undergrads and have to teach something that I wasn't confident. So talk about imposter syndrome. I didn't even have my MBA. I was a graduate assistant teaching a class. It was very uncomfortable. I put way more energy into teaching that class than I did into the classes I was taking as an MBA. Right? And that was my first exposure. But what I realized is that I had students say to me, I understood this in a way I never did when I took those other classes, which were all the business statistics classes that we all have to take. And I tell every class how many, I think 4 times I dropped business statistics before I ever actually passed one. And back in the day, we had unlimited withdrawal privileges. So the strategy was sign up, try to pass until the week before finals week, and then drop. And so what I would do is I would withdraw the week before finals because there's no way I'm going to pass at this point, right? So I didn't end up with an F. Okay. Right. Plus, it would look like I was registered for more credits. This is how I ended up a 3rd semester sophomore. And so I was not good at it all. And then later to actually be entrusted with teaching, statistics level classes in college, like that's crazy talk, right? So, in fact, I went to a class reunion a few years ago, and my classmates from the University of Puget Sound were aghast that I was allowed to teach in college. They were floored. They're like, you? What's wrong with this world? I don't know. Like it's a thing now, right? But I think, that my experiences early on helped me be a better teacher, because I know what it feels like not to get it. I know what it feels like to not want to go to class because you're so far behind you can't possibly, catch up. I know what it feels like to not know where your book is, right? Now, my job is to help people learn that that's not a lifetime sentence. Even if you fail the class because you don't show up. I'm not going to pass people because they want to. I'm only going to pass them if I feel like they understand the material enough to be successful at the next stage. And sometimes that's the first time, and sometimes it's the second time, and sometimes it's the third time. But what's more important than whether they pass the first, second, or third is that they realize that stuff is not working, right? That if you want to learn something, it's going to be practice. It's going to be effort. It's going to take time. It's probably not going to be easy. If it is easy for you, wonderful. You've got natural talent. But we can't be naturally talented in everything. I certainly am not. And there's lots of things you're gonna have to learn how to do in life and in work that you're not naturally good at. So how do you do that, right? And that's what we would call grit or resilience, right? You just gotta keep coming back again and again, and you have to say to yourself, all right, so I don't understand it yet, but I can get there. And the fact that I now understand, marketing research and statistics at a level that I never did, that's amazing to me. And I see that as transformational. That can help anybody. Because if I can do it, I'm telling you, I was pretty backwards. And then to get turned around straight and, be looking in front of me with clear eyes, that's the biggest transition. So I think that's part of, the idea of what I call the accidental professor. Like, again, I didn't have a plan. This was not the plan, right? But it's better than anything I could have ever imagined. But you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. You have to be willing to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because if I had waited to be confident before I did it, I never would have did it, right? The confidence loop is a really important concept to know, is that anything that you want to be confident in, you got to start somewhere. And invariably, it's going to start with, I kind of suck at this. How do I get better?
So what do you think the next steps are for you in your career?
Oh boy, the eternal question. I don't know. I think I don't know what the end is, but I think the next steps are to keep learning. I think that we are learning how to learn better in the classes that we're doing. I think we're learning in the marketing program, which has been wonderful, supporting this effort of really practically applied education. And we're doing it at the 381, 382 level, which is marketing research and consumer behavior. We're doing it at the, at the elective level in both digital marketing and in applied IMC. Like, we're having these classes where students do things. And I think this allows students to experience professional marketing in a way that gives them confidence. And I think that, to me, like, we just need to keep learning how to do that better and keep refining and get it to something that is repeatable. The secret to scaling is a venture, whether that's a small business or a company that you want to go global or a college class. It's that you have to find something that is repeatable, that you can make better. It's fine to pivot and improve it and change it, but then once you find it, you've got to sense that and go, okay, now we need to scale that. And I think that's the key, is to keep learning and getting there so that we can make it better, so that in 5 years, the students who take this curriculum will have a much better experience than you had, just like your experience is better than the students 5 years ago, right? That we got to keep growing and learning. So I think that's what's next in my adventure here. Now, where that ends up, am I going to teach for another 20 years? Am I going to do something different? That part I don't know, and quite frankly, I ask myself that every day, especially during finals when it's all grading.
Yeah. Move to Sardinia.
Yes, exactly. Yes, Sardinia, Portugal.
All right. So where do you see the industry heading, like the marketing industry, and is there anywhere you want it to head? Like, do you have a vision for it?
Well, where I see it heading is a continual fragmentation and growth. I think one of the basic ideas I try to get across early on at the marketing principles level, of course, is that marketing is everything. Marketing is business. Too many people think marketing is promotions, and it's not. It's really, product development and distribution strategy and pricing and then promotion, but all focused on who are the people who have a problem that we need to help. Okay, so you think about it, like, it's everything from beginning to end. Okay, so as more and more people discover this, they see how marketing is a solution, and the marketing is like the universe. It just keeps expanding. It just keeps doing this, right? So once upon a time it was this, and now it's here, and where's it going to be when we get AI involved? I'm starting to see AI for content marketing, where I'm wondering at what point I'm going to have to deal with students having artificial intelligence write their blog posts. They just put in keywords and topics, and then it automatically writes it for them. And right, so we would, of course, in academia go, that's not cool. But if you're a content marketing organization and you've got to generate 500 blog posts a year, the real idea is in the strategy. Is it that a human being is going to write each one of those? But what if AI can actually write it better and faster and cheaper? Right? So what about that? Is that okay, or is that lack authenticity? Right? What about if we're talking to a chatbot and they can answer everything, all of our answers, because they are a learning algorithm that looks like a human being? But how do we respond to that as consumers? Do we feel like that's fake and that's not real, and therefore that turns us off, even though the answers are great and exactly what we need? So I think there's all these different things that are left to sort of understand, and human beings are odd and weird and don't always react rationally to things. COVID's a good example. I would have imagined that students would love taking classes from their bed. I think I would have been great for me when I was in college. My bed was where I spent a lot of my time, right? But apparently students don't like that. Apparently students want to go to an in-person classroom experience. So that's kind of counterintuitive. I think that we're going to learn many of the same things in marketing over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years of y'all's career. Where would I like to see marketing go? I would like to see it become more authentic. I would like to see people, the perception of marketing change from manipulating people into buying things that they don't want, into helping people solve problems. That marketing can be a force for good in the world, and it's not about just getting over and convincing people to do something that they don't really want to do. And I think oftentimes when people say marketing colloquially, what they mean is promotion and manipulation, and I think that turns people off to marketing, and we need more brilliant minds in marketing. We don't need people going the other direction because they think it's manipulating and taking advantage of others. So I think that's what I would like to see marketing be, is more authentic, that it is perceived more as a way to make the world a better place, and less as a way to take advantage of people.
Do you have any advice for students that are about to graduate and enter the industry?
So much we probably don't have time for it all. Number one, I think, is to think about your career as a marketing effort. That we are brands, and that people and companies react to us the same way they react to brands, and they can develop positive feelings about us or negative feelings about us based on how we behave. And so we have to, number one, be highly cognizant of that I want students to think about being strategic about their careers. I talked earlier about the concept of positioning. That's one of the reasons that I make IMC students develop their own creative strategy and their own professional portfolios. It's about getting them to think about their career as a brand that they need to strategically launch. Right? So that's number one. Number two would be that everything in life is a shitty first draft. And that includes your first job. That includes, everything that you do. And I think we have this sense of that we have to launch into the world fully formed. And you have all these role models, whether they be college professors or celebrities or people in your family that you see today, but you didn't see them when they were 21. And you don't understand what they went through to get where they are. And so how could you possibly understand, and yet we compare ourselves to them? And that's unfair. It's unfair to ourselves. I think all the time how much further along you guys are than I ever was at 21. At 21, I was a college dropout. We were working in landscaping, manual labor, and then a few years later I went to make shipping pallets, right? What they stack, crates on and things, right? I was making shipping pallets with a nail gun, right? And half of a college degree. And so you guys are so much further along than I was, and yet I don't think you always give yourselves credit for it. You compare yourselves to your professors or to your parents, or where were your parents at 21, right? Who knows, right? I don't want to pass judgment, but if they were anywhere near where I was, oh my gosh, right? So I think that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is that those who seem to launch first, everybody thinks is constantly going to be successful, and that's not always the case. It's like, the student who finishes the exam first doesn't always get the highest score. And yet everybody watches them walk out of the room and they're like, oh man, how did they do that, right? Like after 40 minutes, maybe because they didn't answer all the questions. Like, you don't know what somebody else's circumstances are. So we see other people sort of seeming to launch and seeming to go well. Well, who knows where they're going to be in 5 years or 10 years, right? So don't compare yourself. Everything in life is a shitty first draft. And if you approach it that way, then you think, okay, I'm going to do the best I can because it's something that I want to be proud of. But I'm not going to think that it's done. And I think too much of our view of life is, okay, I did it once, I'm done. And especially in learning, I want students to approach not just school, but also the professional life like they're a professional athlete, right? Like they're going to train for this, like hours a week, And if we approach schoolwork like we do intramurals, and how many hours people will put in the gym and all that sort of thing. I know people who will work out way many more hours in a week in the gym than they will work their brain out on school. Well, how do we change that thinking as a professional when you're graduating, so that you look at this is a profession, this is something worth being good at, not because I'm going to make more money, not because I'm going to get more prestige, but because it's fulfilling. Right? And that's what I love about my job. It's fulfilling. Is it always easy? No. Do I get tired of it? Sure. But it's fulfilling to help people develop themselves personally and professionally in a way that all the other things I did in life to earn money were never as fulfilling. So that's look for fulfillment, look for purpose.
I love that. And I think that very much reflects your kind of interest in marketing being more authentic and kind of having a purpose behind marketing. And you absolutely frame kind of college students as people who need to market themselves. And if you're fulfilled by what you're doing, then you're authentic as well. And I think that really is powerful.
I think it has a lot of power because if we think about marketing as developing the product, and you are the product, one of the most important times in your life as a student is to develop your product. It's not about promoting your product, right? Right now is like, how do I put as much as I can in now to develop as much so that later I have something to promote? And I think that if we look at this opportunity that you have during these formative years, we call them, then you have something later. And it doesn't stop there, because this is just the beginning of a lifetime of growth and learning. If I had stopped growing at 21 or 22, where would I be? If I had stopped growing when I graduated from college at 36, where would I be? Right? And I all the time I tell students, I'm teaching you things that I have learned that have helped me be successful in school, in my profession, and in life. And a lot of it I did not learn the first time when I went through college. And so I think becoming a lifelong learner and seeing this endeavor as developing yourself, I think that's the most powerful piece. And then you will have something to talk about that other people will be interested in. Mm-hmm. And the most important thing that you can talk about, understanding how marketing works, is about their problem and how you can help them solve it. I think we spend too much time in career counseling trying to figure out, what do I say about myself?
Right.
And what we need to be doing is focusing more on their problem first, and then how do we help them with their problem, not about myself, because myself disconnected from their problem just sounds egotistical. And it's not about us, it's about them. They're the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. No one wants to hear you talk about yourself.
And yet it's
if
hard
it
to do.
It doesn't
isn't
have
it?
meaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yet it's hard to do. Because, and I think what passes a lot for career advice is too much focus on yourself. Instead of, people are, yeah, well, you got to figure out, how do you put your best foot forward? How do you no, what you got to do is, your best foot is being interested in their foot. That's it, right? When you're like, look at that fungus, let's talk about that for a minute, right? Then they're like, yeah, this is really bothering me. You got any solutions? And the next thing you know, right, you've got a conversation. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, right? The biggest thing that we have to reorient our thinking about as marketers is, it's about them, not us, right? And that if we keep the focus on helping them, this will all take care of itself, and it'll be fulfilling.
Right.
Because it doesn't feel like a transaction, it feels relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think what resonates so much about a lot of your teaching is that you very much practice what you preach. You are also comfortable with being uncomfortable, and you also adapt and constantly learn and do all of the things you tell us to do. I have one more question. What is your personal definition of marketing?
My personal definition of marketing. I think it's a version of what I sort of related to earlier. But my personal definition of marketing is helping people solve problems. So I think about doctors. They're marketers. They don't realize they're marketers, but they're marketers. You walk in, you're like, I got a thing, doc. And they're like, well, tell me about it, right? And then, they start poking around, and it's a diagnostic process. And then they do something to help you, or they tell you, it's really not a problem. It's totally natural, but whatever. They're helping you understand the problem. Let's put a process together. Now, that's oftentimes not simple, right? We all want the silver bullet. Like, give me a pill, I can take it once, and boom, it's all good, right? And the same is true in the marketing world. But the idea that it takes some time sometimes. So there are many, many, many people out there that are great marketers that don't think about it as marketing, right? And it's really about helping people solve problems in a way that is beneficial to both them and to the brand, right? Because otherwise, then that's not necessarily something that is an exchange, right? And there's nothing wrong with altruism, just one-way giving. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's a little bit different maybe than what we would think about as marketing. So I think if we can get people to understand that this idea that we're just trying to help solve people's problems, which means you've really got to think about them and their problem, how you can help them, not you. And when we put it on that level, it's really quite simple. Everything else is just a method, right? But the real focus, if it remains here, if we can come back to that, and I'll tell you, the hardest thing for any brand to answer is who's my customer and what's their problem.
Yeah.
And so many people, I say, who's your customer? They're people who need my product, right? It's like you make hats. People who wear hats. Okay, well, there's all kinds of different kinds of hats. So what kind of, well, we make cowboy hats. Okay, well, then what is the problem they have for that, right? Like, and man, I'll tell you, they really, really struggle with that. And I think that singular focus on the people and the problem and understanding that everything else flows from that, if you can master that, I mean, that is a method that just keeps yielding beautiful things, because most people, and I just had this happen last week, with a person who runs a program, who just asking that question completely flipped how they think about everything. And later they sent an email saying, thank you so much, like we had never thought about that before. And it's quite frankly, it's such a simple question, right?
Real simple.
Real simple.
There you go.
Exactly.
There you go.
I love it.
I love that. I love that tied all back in. Tied back in.
Really is that simple, right?
It really is, though, and I think
Yeah.
I think that is what makes you so good at teaching, is that you make things, you simplify them down to the main concept, and then that resonates and people remember it.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. We've really had a great time hearing your advice and kind of about your very interesting career path and experience in college and now as a professor. Okay, well, if you want to follow Dan on social media, we'll have all of his socials linked in the description below.
Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast today. You can follow Marketing by the Minute, post on all of our socials, also in the link below. And we want to give a special shout out to our team behind the camera, our producers Sarah Sloan and Carly Kildall, our editor and sound engineer Arnav Sengupta, our product manager Jason, and of course our instructor Dan Purdy.
We're your hosts, Talia Akama Gray
And Steiner Michelson.
Talk to you next time on Marketing by the Minute on the Scene.